All right, Counselor, you're on.
Thank you. At 5 o'clock on the dot, we will call the Quality of Life Committee to order. And if we can get a roll call, that'd be great.
Counselor Jamie Cassett-Sanchez.
Here.
Counselor Michael Garcia.
He's excused. Oh, no, he's here. Hi. Sorry.
Hey, good afternoon, Madam Chair. Present.
Counselor Rivera.
I'm here.
And Councilwoman Renee Villarreal.
Present.
Sorry, and Chair Carol Romero-Worth.
I'm here as well.
Great.
Terrific. If we could have a motion to approve the agenda, assuming there are no changes, except Jennifer.
Yes, there are changes.
Yeah.
Item 6B is being reevaluated by staff, and so it's going to be postponed.
Okay. And with that, we need a motion to amend as amended. Yeah, fabulous.
Second.
Jennifer, can you call the roll?
Counselor Michael Garcia.
Yes.
Counselor Chris Rivera.
Yes.
Councilwoman Renee Villarreal.
Yes.
Counselor Jamie Cassett-Sanchez.
Yes.
And Chair Carol Romero-Worth.
Yes. All right, with the agenda approved, we will move to the consent agenda. Are there items the committee would like to discuss tonight?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Councilor Garcia.
I'd like to pull item D as in dog.
D as in dog, okay. Any others?
Madam Chair, I also wanted to pull item D.
Okay, looks like that might be it. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as amended?
Move to approve as amended.
Second.
Jennifer, can you call the roll?
Who was that second?
Counselor Rivera.
Okay, I heard two voices, so I want to make sure I got the right one.
Jennifer,
Counselor
Jennifer, you're saying me and Councilwoman Cassett-Sanchez sound alike?
No, I just heard two at the same time. I didn't know who I should assign it to.
I'm just kidding. Yes.
Counselor Chris Rivera.
Yes.
Councilwoman Renee Villarreal.
Yes.
Counselor Jamie Cassett-Sanchez.
Yes.
Counselor Michael Garcia.
Yes.
And Chair Carol Romero-Worth.
Yes. All right, so with the approval of consent agenda, we will go back to approval of the minutes for October 7th. Are there changes from the committee? And if not, we'll do a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
And one more time, the roll.
Councilwoman Renee Villarreal.
Yes.
Counselor Jamie Cassett-Sanchez.
Yes.
Counselor Chris Rivera.
Yes.
Counselor Michael Garcia.
Yes.
And Chair Carol Romero-Worth.
Yes. Okay, so that motion passes. We've approved the minutes. And we will move now to the consent item that was pulled. That's item 6D, a request to publish notice of a public hearing on December 9th. And this is an ordinance amending section 14-6.2 to adopt an ordinance, a maximum of 1,000 short-term rental permits in the city, to prospectively limit the number of short-term rental permits to 1 per natural person, to prospectively limit the proximity of short-term rental units, to require a local operator for short-term rental units to adopt record keeping and reporting requirements for short-term rental unit owners and host platforms, and to clarify other provisions of the short-term rental ordinance, amending the land use code definitions in section 14-12.1 as they relate to short-term rental units, and amending section 12-2.3 to clarify that a short-term rental unit is not a group R1 occupancy for purposes of fire inspections. And we have tonight Sally Paez with the City Attorney's Office and Director Isaacson with the Land Use Office. So Sally, are you gonna start this off?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Romero-Worth, members of the committee. Did you want sort of a brief introduction and overview? I'm not used to presenting things to this group, so.
Yeah, I think so. This bill, this is its first appearance before any of the council committees. And there are two sponsors of this bill who sit on this committee, Councilor Villarreal and myself. So I do think for the benefit of the rest of the members, we need to take some time and just kind of maybe walk through what this does, and then we can go from there.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So this legislation was originally introduced back in June, and it was part of two companion pieces of legislation. The other piece was the amendments to the Land Use Code enforcement provisions that adopted civil penalty option for land use code violations. Both of those bills were introduced at governing body, and they were taken to the Planning Commission in June. And I could talk about the specifics of the bill, but some of them have changed. So I think I'll start with kind of the procedural overview of kind of what happened there. The Planning Commission did conduct a lengthy public hearing. They postponed a recommendation because they got so much input and it was such sort of a complicated piece of legislation that they wanted more time to digest. And they did prepare a memo with input and suggestions and comments to the council committees and to the governing body. And they postponed so that they could sort of finish reading through comments and think through everything and make a final recommendation at a subsequent meeting. So I think there was around almost 30 people who spoke at that meeting, and there were quite a lot of written comments that were also submitted. And your packet here tonight, I know it's incredibly long, but I wanted to give the members of the public sort of the opportunity to be heard and for you to see sort of the amount of input that we've already received. We got a lot of very high quality, I think, input from our stakeholders and constituents on the bill, and a lot of really good feedback. So that's why I've attached it and given you this, almost 300-page document. And after the Planning Commission hearing, the sponsors met and they looked at the input from the Planning Commission. I think some of them probably watched the Planning Commission meeting and reviewed some of the input received, and decided that it would be worthwhile to consider amendments to the bill before proceeding to the council committees, and to again sort of digest the large volume of input that had been received and potentially meet with other stakeholders, groups that wanted to talk to their counselors. And so the sponsors did decide to sort of pull the short-term rental bill off of the legislative schedule. The civil penalties bill, as I'm sure you recall, proceeded through the council committees and was adopted by the governing body. So that is actually in effect, and this isn't the time to give updates on that, but we're working on hiring some hearing officers and moving towards really being able to implement that. So that's really exciting. Meanwhile, we took the short-term rental bill. The sponsors did make quite a few changes, and it was determined that it would be easier to just reintroduce a new bill, because sort of creating a red line for a substitute bill or an amendment sheet was going to be pretty hard to look at, because part of what we're doing here is a lot of cleanup on the existing bill. So even changes that really aren't substantive, there's some rearranging and things like that. So the amount of redlining already in there, it is, as I'm sure you noticed, a little difficult to get through everything. So for simplicity, the sponsors have reintroduced a new bill, and that draft is what went back to the Planning Commission last week. They held a public hearing on the second draft of this legislation as a new bill last Thursday, the 15th. They did receive, again, over 20 people spoke at the meeting. A fair amount of written comment was submitted, but the vast majority of it did come in late. And because it came in late, the Planning Commission did not have a chance to review and consider it in making their recommendation. But what I have done is compiled that into a PDF. I've asked Ms. Fabian to attach that to PrimeGov. So hopefully, I think that's in here somewhere. I never followed up. I trust her. And if not, it will be provided for subsequent council committee meetings and a governing body. So we did compile those written comments. We assured folks that, you know, we didn't get your written comments to the Planning Commission in time, but come speak at the meeting and send us your stuff and we'll forward it on. So all of that's in your packet. So that's kind of the procedural posture. The Planning Commission ultimately did recommend approval. They also decided to submit additional comments on the second draft, and I'm working with them right now. I should be able to present for the next council committee and subsequent committee meetings their memo with 3 areas where they wanted to provide additional comments, and I can sort of mention those as I sort of go through the substance of the bill. So they are providing some additional comments of areas where they think further consideration may be warranted, but they did recommend approval of the legislation. And so this is the first opportunity I know for some of the counselors to review and discuss this and ask questions. So I can provide, I guess, just a brief overview of some of the main changes that we're looking to make. First, there's a couple of limitations on the number of permits. And I want to start by sort of clarifying that permits are issued for short-term rental units on residentially zoned property. We do a separate category of registrations for short-term rental units on non-residentially zoned properties. So part of, I think, what's important in sort of understanding the legislation is that there is a distinction between the permits on residential and the registrations on the non-residential. So for residential, we do have some permit limits in the draft legislation. One of them is a cap of 1,000 permits citywide. And that's actually our current cap that's currently in place, but right now it's in a resolution. This bill would move that into our ordinance to have all of our legal requirements and restrictions kind of more centrally located in the code where folks can hopefully more easily access it, have that as part of our sort of binding authoritative law. We also have a new provision that would limit permits to 1 permit per person. And we've defined them as natural person. So permits must be held in the name of an individual human being, not not a business, not a group, not an LLC. However, we have clarified in this draft that the underlying property can be owned by a business or an illegal entity such as a trust. It's just that the permits that we want to issue those directly to an individual person in their own name. Other permit limits in this draft, let's see. So those are the main limits on the permits. We've added some limits on density and proximity. We have a current rule that says you can't have more than 2 short-term rental units directly adjoining on a residential street, but it's a little difficult to apply and interpret our current provision. We're looking to move towards a radius restriction. So if there's already a permitted short-term rental unit within 50 feet of your property, you cannot get a permit unless you fall into one of the exceptions. There's exceptions for folks that can comply with our accessory dwelling unit, I think is the most notable exception to that. There's also limitations to, on residentially zoned property, how many short-term rental units you can have in a multiple family dwelling developments. So apartment complexes, fourplexes and greater, there's a limit of 25% of the units in the overall complex that can have short-term rental permits. And there's a limit of a maximum of 12 short-term rental units in any single building, with the idea being that if you're gonna have more than 12 in a building, you should operate as a hotel or a motel. Let's see. Other items of note, the draft legislation would retain the existing limitation that a short-term rental unit cannot be rented more than once in a 7-day period. And that applies only on the residentially zoned property in this draft. And we're retaining an existing rule that short-term rental permits cannot be transferred. So it's more of a license similar to a business license. It's personal to that one individual human being who has obtained the permit, and it's not transferable. We have clarified that you can still put your property, say, into a trust or something like that. without that being a change of ownership, that would trigger the loss of the permit, but there's a no transfer provision. And then for the most part, we're retaining existing rules on the non-residentially zoned property that are pretty consistent with what we have now. This proposal would raise the permitting or the registration fee to be commensurate with the permit fee. So we would be charging the same annual fee regardless where your short-term rental permit or unit is located, whether it's a permitted unit on residential or a registered unit on non-residential. So we did raise that, and the same maximum of 12 units in a single building limit would apply on non-residentially zoned properties. So that is a new provision for them. Those are the kind of the main rules in terms of the operators and the owners. Oh, and also some new reporting requirements in terms of the types of records. Right now, we've said you have to keep records for 3 years, but we haven't said what they are. So we've tried to provide a little more information there. We've included some new rules about host platforms. So the host platform provisions require the host platform to have a field for the registration or permit number. And we've incorporated a provision that would allow the city to notify, say, Airbnb or VBRO that there's an invalid listing on their website based on, we saw this listed permit number, or maybe there was a missing permit number, and we can say you need to take this down, and they have to take it down within 5 days. Also requiring them to send us a monthly list of their URLs so that we can have a way to look and see who's listing in the city and cross-reference to give us more tools for audits, things of that nature. And we've clarified our fire inspection rules. So I think that's
Sally, one
a
other.
lot.
Yeah, one more. The you have to be accessible by telephone or.
Thank you. Yes, I know I was forgetting something. I'm just sort of honestly going off the top of my head. We've had
You're doing a great job for the top of your head.
a local operator provision. So right now we do require folks to list the name of a contact who's going to be available, but we don't have a rule that they have to be anywhere physically near the short-term rental unit. So potentially you could have a property management company overseas, anywhere. What we've changed this to is a local operator who's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to respond to issues and who can be physically present at the short-term rental unit within an hour. So that is a good one. Thank you, Chair Romero-Worth. Eli, am I missing anything else? Sponsors, huge, important things that I forgot? I'm rambling off sort of the general overview. Right. Oh, and we are, one more thing that I should mention is that we're grandfathering in existing permits and registrations for the most part. So if we do have some people in Santa Fe who currently hold more than one permit, I think we've got a pretty decent handful that maybe have 2 and a smaller number of folks that hold more than 2 permits, and those people will be allowed to timely renew those. So if they continue to file their renewal applications, file their annual fees, pay their taxes, stay out of trouble, those will be renewable. So I think that's kind of a very important point, including if they don't meet our new proximity rules. So even if they're too close together, I own 3 and they're all within 50 feet, I can keep those and annually renew those as long as I own the property and comply with all of the rules. So.
Great. I think that was a great summary and a lot of information about the path that we've been on over the last, I don't know what, 4 to 6 months. Is that right? Oh, God, time's a blur. So I think from there, unless Director Isaacson has more to add, at the pleasure of the committee, we can go to questions if everybody is ready to do that. So,
Chairwoman Romero-Worth, the only thing that I would maybe add would be to maybe give a brief recap of the types of comments we received at Planning Commission
good idea.
on Wednesday, or excuse me, last Thursday evening. I'm not sure if folks on this committee have had a chance to review that meeting yet or not, but we received sort of from, as Sally mentioned earlier, we received, I believe, 21 or so individuals providing public testimony at Planning Commission. A couple of those individuals expressed some concern about the 200-foot buffer for properties that are zoned non-residential if they're within 200 feet of property zoned residential. We put some further restrictions on the number of STR units that can be on those properties. And then the other comment that we heard a lot about was folks in Santa Fe who own short-term rental units concerned about the 1 stay per 7-day period. I think it's important to explain what that actually means. So the 1 stay per 7-day period, it does not mean, as some people have mentioned, that you must stay for 7 days. It does not mean that. It also does not mean that you have sort of you need a 7-day gap between visits. What it means is that if you were a short-term rental host and you rented your unit, say on a Thursday through a Tuesday, you would not be able to rent that unit again until the following Thursday. But it also means that if you were to rent your short-term rental unit for 1 night on a Friday, you would not be able to rent it for the rest of that week until the following Friday. And so that's, there was some concern by folks who own and operate short-term rental units that was limiting their ability to operate and generate income from their units. The third comment came actually from the Planning Commission. Commissioner Satania had some questions about whether or not it would be possible to create a carve out in the transferability of the short-term rental permits in the event that, say, a spouse were to die. The property is owned by both spouses. However, the permit is held by just one individual. If that individual was to, unfortunately pass away, could we then transfer that permit to the surviving spouse? And so those are the sort of the 3 big ideas that came out of the Planning Commission meeting last week.
And Sally, maybe you can, so the Planning Commission recommended that we pass this bill, but those 3 items they asked that we revisit, correct?
Yes, Chair Romero-Worth, they did suggest further consideration of those 3 areas. And in fact, I guess their draft memo is pretty much final now. I asked them to contact me by the close of business today with any edits. So I should be able to circulate that to you. And I know what it says at this point. They are recommending that the 1 stay per 7 days provision should probably be removed, that the transfer provision should be maybe reconsidered altogether, but maybe just tightened up to sort of at least protect maybe a spouse in the situation of an untimely death, as Eli was speaking of, things like that. And then they raised some anomalies and concerns with a rule about the rental units within 200 feet and said that should probably be removed as well. So there were 2 things that they said you should reconsider it and maybe get rid of it. And the transfer provision, they said maybe you should revise this further. So, and I can distribute that to the full governing body as long as it's not discussed by email. So I think that's something that I can go ahead and provide to y'all really soon. But I do have pretty much a final draft at this point.
Great. And I would just add that the sponsors are discussing those 3 items. And so that's under consideration. So with that, I think we are ready to go to questions. Is everybody all right to go to questions? Okay. Councilor Garcia, I see your hand is up.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the land use team and the 3 councilors for putting this together. As everybody knows, District 2 has been deeply impacted by the short-term rental kind of vigilantism that's been going on, and hopefully, some of these changes will have some positive effects on the communities. So, but I still have the mindset we need to. Key number 1 is enforcement, and hopefully this will allow for some additional tools in the tool belt for enforcement. first, I guess I as well have concerns about the rental once per 7 days. I can understand where the concerns came in and looking at to limit traffic potentially in communities. And I guess my question is, why wasn't a shorter time period maybe looked at, 3 days? Because I think you gave a great example, Eli, when you said if somebody rents it on a Friday, they're out on a Friday. Or let's give a better example. Somebody rents on a Tuesday night, they're out by Thursday. So maybe somebody wanted to rent it on Saturday. With this potential change, it's not an option. Whereas, if we limited it to maybe every 3 days, every 2 days, I mean, I have the mindset, let's take it out in general. But if we're looking at a time frame, I would say no more than 3 days. Just because I don't think you're going to see increase in traffic. It's not going to bring much more traffic than a normal residency would have. Yeah. So I guess maybe that's a question for the counselors or land use. Why 7 days? Why not a shorter time period? And if folks are open to just eliminating that in general.
I think this one really raises implementation and enforcement concerns more than anything. And so Eli and our system is usually that he handles those kind of questions. So I'll pass to him.
Thank you, Sam. So I think it's a very good question, Councilor Garcia. And it's one that I've had, bear with me because it's sort of difficult to explain. But so the reason why the 1 per 7 day makes sense in my mind is because we definitely have days of the week that are sort of the primary days where people want to rent their units, right? And those are pretty much, I would say, Thursday or Friday through Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And so if we were to start putting less than a week interval on things, I think sort of the spacing between stays would start to overlap with those primary days where people really want to rent. And I think that would lead to many of the same concerns by our permit holders that we have now in terms of, hey, I can't rent this when people want to stay in my unit. And so I'm not sure if that's, I understand the thought process behind it, but in terms of implementation and enforcement, and then how these are actually rented out and work, I'm not sure if that's actually a better solution or not. I think really what it comes down to is do we think that we want to moderate the frequency in which people are visiting and staying and coming and going, or do we not? And if we decide that we do, then I think we should keep the 1 per 7 day provision in place. And if we feel that we shouldn't be moderating the frequency of visits, then I think we should remove it. But to try to fine tune it less than at a smaller interval than we have now, I don't think will make a significant improvement, and will also present implementation and enforcement issues moving down the road.
Eli, the only thing I would add to that, Councilor Garcia, is that it is current law. So that doesn't mean we can't change it, but just so you know, that provision is actually in the law right now.
Right.
Chair, on that point,
Yes, Councilor.
I was actually going to say the same thing. That wasn't something we changed. It was already in the ordinance, and it's just coming to light because people have been paying more attention to this particular ordinance and the changes. So, and also we've asked about that, and it's complex because if somebody lives right next to a short-term rental and it's changing consistently, it's very disruptive. And so what's the happy medium? I don't know. But in some cases, people feel like having constant turnover and new tenants every few days is just not okay. So yeah, I just wanted to note that. And also it's hard to enforce anyway. This piece is a bit hard, but I'm wondering, like you said, Eli, about how if you change the number, then it ends up being even more complex to try to enforce. That's all. Thank you.
Councilor Garcia, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on that point, I don't know how much disruptive. I mean, most of the folks that are renting aren't coming into throw wild parties, and especially with this ordinance, it's not allowed. So I think I would strongly encourage us to remove that. I mean, it's obvious we weren't enforcing it in the past. We don't have the capacity to enforce it. Let's just say in a perfect world, we're maxed out at 1,000 rentals. That means somebody is going to have to keep an eye on ensuring that all 1,000 folks are only renting once per week. And that is going to take a team of folks to manage that. So I think if we had the capacity, I'd say sure, but I know that unfortunately we don't have the capacity to do so. So with that, I would highly encourage us to relook at that, the once every 7 days. I had a quick question because I know it was in the ordinance in the past, but times are changing, and it prohibits recreational vehicles being parked on the property. I know we allow individual homeowners to park a recreational vehicle on their property within certain limitations. Given the current pandemic we're facing, we are seeing an uptick in recreational vehicle purchases. Folks feel that's their most comfortable and safest way to travel. And given that's how we saw a lot of our guests come into Santa Fe anyway, which was vehicles, and maybe they're going to now bring a recreational vehicle. So I'm wondering if that's going to be prohibitive in some senses, where there's a certain faction of the tourism industry is changing, and we're now telling folks you have to find an RV park to park your vehicle, and on top of that, rent a vehicle to get around the city of Santa Fe. So I don't know if the sponsors would be open to that. Maybe discussion. I'd like to hear more about that, just because I know that, like I said, I know that recreational vehicles have become somewhat of a blight issue in general, but it's allowed. And I want to ensure that we're not doing anything that's going to prohibit some tourism. So
If I may, just as a prelude, Member Garcia, just in terms of what was in the ordinance and what is in the ordinance, it is in our current ordinance and there has not been a proposal to remove it. So the current draft bill says, an owner or operator shall not allow guests to park recreational vehicles on site or on the street. So it would prohibit them either on the property or parked in front. So that's
right.
what it says. As to whether it should change, I will leave that to the policymakers to debate.
No, and I understand it was in there. That my point was that our tourism, the way folks are traveling is changing. And it's evident we're seeing an uptick in recreational vehicle purchases across the country. And given the current situation with the pandemic, that's not going to change for the foreseeable future. So my question is, are we prohibiting a certain faction of the tourism economy and saying, well, come to Santa Fe, but you can't stay at an Airbnb with your RV? And so I guess that's a question for the broader committee. Is that something we really want to do, given that our current portfolio for the city relies heavily on tourism dollars? And if we're not allowing folks to come in and they're having to do other means, like I said, park at an RV park, or just not come to Santa Fe. I mean, just tossing it out there. What are other counselors' ideas on this?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilor Villarreal.
Well, I hear you about the traveling changes. And yeah, I think more people will be traveling in that way. But I think about some of the narrow streets in my district, and there's no way RVs are going to fit. And so I don't know if there's another provision that prevents that, because I think it just is kind of a case-by-case basis. Some streets might be appropriate if there's space, and there's others, there's no way that people would be able to utilize Airbnbs with RVs parked on the street or even in the driveways. So I'm not sure how to tackle that one, because I think it just depends on what part of the the city, people are considering bringing RVs to Airbnbs or vacation rentals. So did you have an idea about that? Because it's kind of, it depends on where you're looking at and accessibility factors.
Right. No, and I completely agree. You know, but I'm trying to have some foresight in the sense that we are going to see an uptick in recreational vehicles coming to Santa Fe. And if that means that those individuals are going to now have to rent hotels, well, then so be it. But I'm just trying to put that out there in the sense that these are challenges that are going to be coming our way. And do we want to look and be proactive versus reactive? Because it also then comes down to, once again, the enforcement. Because somebody's going to, if they roll into town on their RV and the property person who runs the property, most times they're not there to check them in. They have a little lockbox, give them the code, they get the keys, and they don't really interact with the person face to face. And so I think then that becomes incumbent of the property owner to ensure that a RV is not on their property, or the neighborhood to then let city know that, hey, this RV has an RV on their property. And when that happens, do we have the capacity then to manage that? What I want to do is, like I said, I want us to begin to be proactive, because a lot of what I've heard in regards to the challenges with STRs is there's just not enough people power to enforce what we have. We can have all the greatest laws and ordinances on the books, but if we don't have enough staff to enforce it, then what's the purpose? So with that, I want to ensure that we're being proactive. That way we have enough people to enforce what we have on the books, and the neighborhood's happy, because I surely know that if we have folks that are out of compliance, we're going to hear from them as the counselors. We're going to hear that you guys at the city aren't doing anything about this. And it just becomes that challenge. Well, we don't have enough people power to enforce what we have on the books, and it just becomes that bigger situation. So like I said, just trying to throw it out there to be proactive, and not that we need to take action on this, just trying to toss those ideas out there just because I see them. I know that when this was introduced earlier this summer, there was a lot of challenges from the business community in regards to the capital business district being treated the same as residential area. So has that changed in this ordinance, and how has it changed?
That's been fixed. Who wants to address that? Eli or Sally?
I'd be happy to. That might be a better question for Sally.
I'm happy to.
They answer it as well.
Sure. So the previous draft of the legislation would have subjected short-term rental units citywide to the permit cap and the permit limits of 1 per person, and the no transfers provision, and the permits cannot be transferred provision. So it would have gone to a sort of one-size-fits-all permitting regime with all of the regulations citywide. And currently we do have the distinction I described at the beginning of the permits versus the registrations, and the different rules depending on whether you're in the business capital district or in a residentially zoned area. So that has been changed in this draft. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the only real significant changes for the business capital district and the non-residentially zoned areas would include the no more than 12 units in a single building. The fees now would match the permit fees. The registration fees and permit fees are the same. And sort of the general record keeping, local operator, fire inspections kind of requirements that have largely not drawn objection from the business community.
Can you talk to so the one thing that I think is still causing heartburn, I think because for the counselors who haven't been living this for the last 6 months, I think it would be useful to talk about the buffer zone and what what that is, and that has not been changed, and the Planning Commission has asked us to look at that. So I think a little bit of time on that particular provision would be a good idea.
Thank you, Chair Marworth. And I kind of forgot. So that's actually not one that was in the previous draft. So we've shifted.
Right.
Well, it was different before.
Right.
So before we would have applied the same the proximity limitations of no more than 25% of a development that's a fourplex or larger could be short-term rental units. We would have applied that all the way across the city, no matter where you are. And in reevaluating this, we looked at, well, what are our purposes? What is the intent of the ordinance? We want to protect residential neighborhoods and the quality of life for folks in residentially zoned areas. And so, you know, how can we help folks that are maybe right at the edges? There's maybe was this perceived, well, maybe it's a border issue. If I'm in a residentially zoned property, but I back up to the business capital district, is there something that we want to do to sort of mitigate those impacts on those people? So we talked about crafting a sort of a provision to target that concern. And what we drafted was a rule that if you are within 200 feet of a residentially zoned property, but you're not residential, you would be subject to that limit of no more than 25% of the units in a fourplex or larger could be short-term rental units to sort of prevent, you know, buildings with a lot of them right next to residential property. So that was actually a new provision in the second draft of the bill, but it has been the one thing that continues to draw criticism from folks in the business capital district. I think some good concerns have been raised. The main thing I think that folks are saying is that if I'm on property that allows as a permitted use a hotel, a motel, a bar, a restaurant, almost any type of relatively disruptive commercial activity, there's no rule that I can't do that within 200 feet. Of course, we have rules about like no liquor within 200 feet of a school. There are some certain, you know, protective things like that. But in the case of sort of conducting these types of businesses, we allow hotels and motels within the 200-foot buffer. We allow, you know, any other permitted use. We're not putting this extra restriction. And so folks were arguing that it's really not fair or maybe kind of anomalous to create a special rule targeting short-term rental within that sort of buffer zone that we were trying to create, with the idea that it might help protect those residential neighborhoods. So that is in the current draft of the bill. It is something that the Planning Commission was recommending reconsidering and something that's kind of been under continued discussions. So.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sally. I really appreciate the thorough review. And so from what I'm understanding is that it would have an impact on businesses that had been operating in a certain manner prior with what's being proposed. I'm seeing some head shaking. So how does the 25%, I know that, you know, for example, we have some properties that are condos, for lack of better words, and whether they're singleplexes, duplexes, quadplexes, a lot of folks, whether they're in town or out of town, purchase them for that purpose of either renting them out as short-term rentals or keeping them as an investment property. And so how does that affect those kind of more so investment properties that aren't usually occupied by permanent residents? It's more so short-term, whether it's somebody renting them out for 30 days or 2 days. How does that impact them? I'm thinking more so, you know, like places, there's a right on, you know, Federal and I think it's Grant Avenue, right around there. There's a kind of somewhat of a complex that has a lot of short-term rentals there. So how does that impact? I don't know if, for lack of a better word, they're not a compound, but they're so home association.
So, Counselor, I think one of the big things to keep in mind as we discuss all the provisions in this draft ordinance is that the changes would be prospective, not retroactive. And so anyone who currently has a short-term rental permit and maintains that permit in good standing and renews in a timely fashion every year will be able to continue to have that permit and operate the way they were operating previously. So this would only apply to new multifamily properties in a non-residentially zoned area within 200 feet of a residentially zoned area.
Right, but no, my point is a lot of these properties are bought and sold with the intention of having them being rented out, whether it's a long-term rental or a short-term rental. And so I guess the answer to my question is yes, they'd be impacted because that's, for example, I have a rental and I want to get out of it and I want to sell it to one of my colleagues. I'm going to sell it to Councilor Villarreal. And she wants to buy it with the intention, hey, this is a great property. I'm going to be able to STR it, make some of my money back and stay there sometime, etc. In that scenario, Councilor Villarreal would have to go through the entire process of applying for an application. And if there's 1,000 people on the wait list, she's waiting for 1,000 people. So I guess my question is, it is going to impact in some instances where if somebody, these properties that are bought with the intention and purpose for investment properties, they're not necessarily long-term homeowners. And that's just the way it's been for 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, Santa Fe's been a tourist destination before I was alive. And, you know, I think we want to ensure that, similar to the RV situation, that we're being proactive and we're not in some senses prohibiting a certain faction of our economy from thriving. I think this more so impacts those, like I said, those kind of communities where there are more, they're kind of compoundish. It's not necessary, they're not residential neighborhoods in that instance. So I think I just don't know the solution to that for that. Another quick question, because I know that there's been, you know, lots of
Counselor, if we could we just clarify that before you go on? Because I think there's a little bit of I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. And Eli, I don't know if you want to clarify it, or Sally, or so.
I'd be happy to try.
Or I can take a try, or I can say what I'm hearing that might need to be understood.
Please, and then I can chime in if there's
okay.
anything.
All right. So I think you have to think about these in two different ways. So there's the non-residential STRs. Though there is no cap on those. So if you're operating in the BCD, in that circle, there can be as many as, you know, there are properties there. We don't have any limits on that. So if you're in the BC, I'm sorry.
Excuse me, but we do have the 12 per building cap.
Right. So, but in terms of whether you can buy a property and turn it into an STR, all you have to do is register it. You don't have to have a permit to operate it. The 1,000 permit cap only applies in the residentially zoned areas. So I just want you to understand the distinction, because I think it's an important one.
No, I appreciate the clarification, Councillor. And I think that covers a lot, but there might be some outliers where there are these, and I'm just trying to think of more on the north end of town, as you're even getting out of side of town, you know, Zocalo, for, you know, something up that direction where, once again, just trying to be proactive, because I'd hate for us to keep coming back to this ordinance to modify and change it. But thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
If I could just add one other comment.
Sure.
Councillor, you know, I think, you know, just to make sure that we understand that we're not, you know, people who are vested in operating the short-term rental permits, we're not changing the rules on that. And so anyone who's coming in to purchase a potential vacation home would know before the time of purchase whether or not that property was eligible to be a short-term rental property, whether or not there were any permits available for them to obtain if they needed one. So I think it's just, we wanted to, when drafting this legislation, we were really wanting to be very aware and sensitive to the fact that people have made investments under a certain set of rules, and that we're not changing the rules for those individuals. We're only changing the rules moving forward, and anyone making an investment from this time forward would know what those rules were and could invest accordingly. So I think that's an important distinction as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Like I said, I know a lot of the challenges were, and at least I'm hearing, is from our residential friends and colleagues and neighbors, and I think that's where we should really be looking and working to address their concerns, and once again coming to help enforce with the situation. I think that's all the questions I had at the moment. I know that I tried to watch the Planning Commission meeting, and I guess it's on the YouTube 2 channel for any of my colleagues that might want to watch it. I tried finding it on the regular City Council YouTube channel. It's on the other one. So, but thank you, Madam Chair. That's all I have at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Garcia. Councilor Cassett Sanchez, your hand is up.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have a few questions there. I tried to organize them into categories, but I failed. So I'm sorry, this might be a little random. One of the things I saw was that there is a renewal date of March 15th for all short-term rentals. But I know that we recently changed that for our business license so that they weren't all falling on the same day. And there were concerns about both impact on our staff as well as service to individuals coming in for business licenses. So I was curious why we didn't look at changing this to that same rule of it just going on an annual basis from whenever you got that permit, and how that impacts land use and their ability to renew these permits in a timely manner and not overwhelm our staff.
Thank you for that question, Councilor. So we actually, in the previous draft, removed that and changed the renewals of short-term rentals to actually align with business licensing. But in thinking through how we would actually administer short-term rentals, and specifically the waiting list when we get to a time when we have a waiting list, we felt that it would be too difficult to manage that on a rolling basis. And so to be effective in managing that, we wanted to have a firm deadline when people who did not renew on time, we would know exactly how many permits were now available, and we could offer those to the next tranche of people waiting on the waiting list, give them an opportunity to apply. If they don't apply and there's more, go to the next group. And so that's why we have decided to keep it the way it is, and ask that people renew their short-term rental business license at the time of renewal of their short-term rental permit.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. I mean, you guys are the ones who are really impacted, so I'll trust you to know what is most efficient for your department. And is that currently how it is that March 15th is when the renewal is for permits? So we're not going to have situations where somebody applied for a permit, in June, and then they've been shortened and the amount that they've been paid?
So you can apply any time of year, but we do ask that people renew by March 15th. We allow them to renew by April 15th, but they are subject to a late fee. I believe it's $50 or maybe $100. I think it's $50. And then beyond April 15th, we do allow we see things coming in. If you've submitted your application and we're still processing it before April 15th, we'll continue to process it. But anything we receive after the April 15th hard deadline, if you have not applied to renew, we consider your permit expired. And if you want to renew after the deadline and there's permits available like there are now, you start over. It's a new application. Now it's not an issue because we're at about 875 of the 1,000 available have been issued. But once we get to a point where the full 1,000 are issued, that will become more of an issue for folks because they will not be able to immediately reapply and get a permit.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that. Now, that actually brings me to another question in terms of where we are with our limits. So we have 875, and are those all within residentially zoned properties?
Thank you, Councillor. That is correct, because we do not, the registrations, which, so if you're non-residentially zoned, you don't have a permit, you have a registration. And the registrations do not apply against the 1,000 permit cap. So so by definition, if you have a short-term rental permit, you are in a residentially zoned area.
Okay, so that was something that was already in place, the permits versus the registrations. Oh, good to know. Thank you. And so then how many registrations do we have operating right now?
Councillor, I don't have that number available to me, but I believe it's at last accounting when we were doing this in June and thinking about pulling the registrations under the cap. We were at about, I believe, 79 to 85, somewhere in that range. So it's probably close to 100, I would say, roughly. About 100 registrations in our non-residentially zoned properties of the city.
Okay, and then how does that, I know that there was a report, I don't know, maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, about the number of short-term rentals that were operating basically under the, I don't know where I was going with that analogy, but without a registration or a permit. And I'm curious how that aligns with what we're seeing here. Do we think that at this point we have most of them registered or permitted? And then when we start to really, if we pass this and we go with the 1,000 permits, do we ostensibly already have 1,000 that are, or over 1,000 that are operating? So there might be a bit of a permit crunch as we move into this.
Thank you, Councillor. So the 1,000 permit limit exists now. It was introduced via resolution. And so the reason why Sally mentioned it earlier, I believe, is because we are now folding it into this ordinance. So it's all the STR regulations are in one place. You know, it's hard to say really how many are operating without the proper permits and registrations. You know, we were just looking into something the other day. We, got, someone alerted us to, they thought that their neighbor was renting short-term rental without a permit. And actually what they were doing is they were doing long-term rentals, but they were still advertised on VRBO and Airbnb, even though they weren't renting it that way. And so that's just to say that it's hard to get conclusive data on how many are operating in the city without the proper permit or registrations. But I would say that it's probably the number of folks that are still operating in these COVID times without the right authorization from the city, both in terms of permits and registrations. I would put that in like the 150 to 200 range right now. We did issue warning letters to folks back in June, and we've issued a second warning letter again here more recently. And after sending out that first letter, we did see an increase in people applying for permits and coming in under the permit system. So we are seeing our enforcement having an impact, and folks are complying now, which we'd like to see. But we do have people operating illegally, and I would think that considering the number that we have currently permitted, which is about 875, plus the folks that are operating without the proper permits, that if everyone were to come under compliance, we would be over the 1,000 cap.
So that being said, I know that we are also working with the platforms to try to identify all those individuals, bring everybody into the permitting system. As we start to run into this issue of bringing everybody in, we're going over that cap. How are we, is it a first come, first serve? Okay, so we're really just telling people get your permit if you want to continue to operate as we move forward with this.
And as Ms. Paez mentioned earlier, we did earlier this year pass a pretty powerful enforcement bill that allows us to issue civil penalties for folks who are operating without the proper, they're operating outside of the line, so to speak. And so it will be first come, first serve. Folks that come in with applications after our 1,000 cap is full will be put on the waiting list in the order that their applications are received. And if we are able to verify that folks are operating, whether they're on the waiting list or not, without the proper permits or registrations, we will be able to issue fines on a a escalating scale. Those fines, if for repeat offenders, may be as much as $500 a day for operating without a license. And so, there's significant penalties, and hopefully that will be enough to deter folks from operating illegally.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, definitely. That's some motivation right there. And then I know that we are working on partnering with the different platforms, and this is part of our strategy to really enforce this. Do we have agreements with how do we get the platforms to comply with what we are asking them to do? Do we have the ability to hold them accountable?
Thank you, Counselor. So Sally may be able to add to this as well. But one of the big areas where we've had cooperation from the platforms hasn't been so much on the listing as much as it has been on the tax collection. And that's where we're seeing quite a bit of help right now. And so since Expedia Group and other platforms have agreed to help us with collecting both lodger's tax as well as GRT, we have seen our revenues going up that STRs are contributing to the city. Some of the conversation we've had with them is making it a requirement that hosts include their permit or registration number on the listing on the platform, so that guests can know if they are, supporting a licensed unit or an unlicensed unit. And we've asked them for some help in other areas as well, and they've shown some willingness. But where they've been the most helpful has been on the revenue side with GRT and lodger's tax collection.
I would agree with that. And I would kind of just chime in to add that it was at the suggestion of both VRBO and Airbnb that we add sort of this notice and takedown provision that would allow us, we would still have to identify an invalid listing. But if we have a rule that says, owners, you need to put a valid city issued permit or registration number on all listings, and they're providing us with all of their URLs in our area so we can actually look at listings and identify if there are any that are not valid, they will remove those listings. And so there are certain things beyond that that they've said, maybe we could do, especially Expedia Group and VRBO. They've consistently wanted to meet with city staff, with the mayor, with the councilors, and they've said things like, well, there are things that we could be willing to do. We do have tools that we put in place for jurisdictions in terms of you can't do less than a 2-night rental, for example. There are certain, it has to be the kind of thing that's can be programmed in, and they would have to agree to it. And since we're sort of still in the drafting stage, but especially VRBO, they've said, if you want a 2-night minimum, we can program that in. If you want no more than 52 in a year, we might be willing to talk to the city about whether we can have a particular listing locked out. You try to rent it out a 53rd time in 1 calendar year and we can prevent it. So they have some ability to do things like that can be easily programmed if they're in our ordinance. There's a limit, I think, to how much we can require. The type of reporting we've put in this ordinance does have the support of Airbnb and VRBO, I think, in terms of they said, these are things we can do. This is stuff we do for other jurisdictions. This is, in our view, a balance between being too much of a burden on us and unfair, or potentially asking for legally protected information that we can't give you about our customers. A good balance to where we can provide this to you. We think this will help you go a long way towards enforcement, and it's something that we can do. So they're a lion's share of the business. It's, I think, harder to reach. There's kind of a myriad of smaller host platforms that I don't know that we're in contact with, but at least those 2 big ones have definitely volunteered some willingness to partner with us. So.
Okay, thank you. That's good to hear. It sounds like it's not something that we can really enforce, but I'm glad that we have been in those conversations. And yeah, I am curious about the other smaller platforms. I think that HomeAway is a thing, perchance, right?
I believe that they're associated with the Expedia group. I
Okay,
think HomeAway and VRBO is all within the Expedia group. Kind of
perfect. And then
umbrella.
Airbnb are their own entity.
Yeah.
Gotta
But
put the lid.
there are quite a few more small ones. I don't know how they're doing if they're still operating these times. They've been less. They haven't reached out to us.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Sorry, let me just go through my notes. You already mentioned the ability to better collect GRT. So that was another one of my questions. I know that that was a really big concern that we were having. I am happy to hear that that has improved. I'm assuming that this will help us. Will this help us further improve our ability? And can you give me a little bit more details there?
Absolutely. Thanks, Counselor. So the reporting requirements that we've included in this ordinance, this draft ordinance, and being more explicit about the types of records that we're asking hosts to permit holders to maintain should assist us further in making sure we are collecting the correct amount of both lodger's tax and GRT to the city.
Well, thank you. And I believe my last question for now, and I think it kind of takes us out of the realm of more precise answers and into a little bit of opinion and discussion. I know one of the concerns that I have had with short-term rentals is the impact on our overall housing market. And there's kind of a couple pieces to that. One, people have said it's not very likely that people are going to be purchasing short-term rentals, for example, in my district, although I argue that that might change if Midtown does what we hope Midtown will do, which is be, another center, or the Rufina Business District, has already started to overturn with Meow Wolf. And so some of the breweries that are popping up there. But also the concern that if people are purchasing investment properties and driving up prices and decreasing available housing on districts 1 and 2, it inevitably starts to push more residential people who are actually here for long-term housing and long-term rentals into districts 3 and 4, and just adding to some of the challenges that we have in the housing market. I'm curious about the thoughts of this. I know that this is not necessarily something that is a concrete answer that we have a lot of data for, but I just think it's an important part of the conversation that I wanted to get both our staff thoughts on, and then as well as the sponsors, if you guys were looking at this and what your thoughts were there.
Thanks, Counselor. Well, I'll jump in and then turn it over to the sponsors. So I think, are short-term rentals impacting housing prices in Santa Fe? I think the answer is yes. I think where it becomes less clear is to what degree. I think in talking about it in our committee meetings, I think it's safe to say a lot of homes that are purchased as vacation rentals here in Santa Fe would not become long-term rental units if they weren't short-term rental units. I think a lot of people are of a sort of income level or level of affluence that they wouldn't have to rent them out long-term. They would just stay empty. So I think that that's something to factor in. I think the O'Donnell report, if I remember correctly, attributed maybe around 15% of the rise in home prices. So not 15, not to say home prices have risen 15% because of short-term rentals, but of the amount that they've risen, 15% of that could be attributed to short-term rentals. So, I think again that there is an impact, but to what degree I think is maybe in some ways counterintuitive and not to the degree that many people think here in the city.
And if I could just add the tiniest bit first, I'm happy to email out that O'Donnell report if that would be helpful. It was from May 2019 by a PhD economist, and so I'm happy to provide that. The other thing that I have kind of in our record for this legislation is a question. At the first Planning Commission meeting, this issue was raised, and you can read this for yourself in the Planning Commission minutes if you have the time and the wherewithal. But there was a question from one of the planning commissioners to Alexandra Ladd specifically on the issue of affordable housing. Obviously, I think is her focus more than sort of overall housing, but she looks obviously at the whole housing market. And what she said was that we don't have a lot of years of very good study on this. So it's hard to have real good like numbers and data. She said research has shown in other communities that there's a tipping point where the number of STRs impact the market. Santa Fe is probably not there yet, but certain neighborhoods do have a higher share of short-term rentals. It's possible those neighborhoods did not offer a lot of affordability due to their location. They were already higher end homes. She thinks it's likely that the initial purchase of a home has created more of an impact on raising the values than the use of your home for short-term rental. So she, long story short, we can ask if Alexandra Ladd's willing to come to further meetings. Maybe she would be an important person to invite to our final public hearing before the governing body. But her opinion, I would paraphrase as being sort of the data is unclear and it's going to impact different parts of town differently, but we don't have real good proof that it's having a negative impact on the availability of long-term housing. And then I'll turn it over if the sponsors want to comment further.
Yeah, I was going to say, and maybe I should have started here. Sorry, Councilor Villarreal. After we get done with questions, I certainly want to give you an opportunity to speak about, you know, why you're a sponsor and what's motivated your interest in this. So, you know, if you want to talk about that now or wait till the questions are finished. Okay, you'll wait. So
go ahead, I'll wait. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So I think though, Councilor Cassett Sanchez, you've had your question answered for the most part.
Can I add to that though?
Sure.
What we're seeing now, and just talking with friends of mine that are in the real estate business, is people are buying property not to move here necessarily. And that's disheartening. I'm sure there's quite a few people moving because they're moving out of large cities. They want to be away from the kind of density aspect of lots of people around. But what I'm seeing also is investment properties. And I don't think we should be having opportunities for people to come in to buy properties just so they can turn it around and make short-term rentals. And so I agree with what Alex said. You know, it doesn't necessarily translate into affordable housing. However, we've talked about in the Community Development Commission that simultaneously we definitely need affordable units, but we also need market rate units and ability for people to live here that work here. And so if those properties became long-term rental units, to me, that's a win for the city because we need more people to live here that work here. And yes, affordable housing is where we have a major deficit. However, we have a great need too for market rate. So I just see it as just overall supporting this is that we're not trying to, I don't think this is punishing people that have existing short-term rentals. And, you know, there are a lot of local people that use this as supplemental income, and we want to support that. We think that's important. And so I don't think that this is really targeting them. The changes are really like into the future, people that are applying that may want to start looking at investment properties and not really caring that the fact is we have districts that there's neighborhoods that are completely full of short-term rentals. And so they're not really contributing in a way that's really about the quality of life of our communities. So existing permit holders that have short-term rentals and they're following the rules, they should be okay. And we made tweaks as we look into the future. And so that's why I really wanted to support this, because I think we're at a turning point where we need to really start digging in, and there will always be people that are unhappy about this. And I think I don't really know why, because some of those people already have short-term rentals and we want to support that. So I think that it's really looking at the possibilities in the future of people buying investment properties, and more than one remind you that it's not just one unit that people think that's going to be their investment. It's people that are buying multiple units that are then turning them around for short-term rentals. So that's, I think, the impetus for me to support this. And there was a lot of work put in. It's very complicated ordinance to begin with. And we're seeing this now because some of the things that people have had consternation about were already in the ordinance. So I think it was very clear that not many people knew what was involved with the current ordinance. And I think with Sally's interpretation and breakdown of what has changed is helpful. But we'll still have some folks that are still not clear about the changes and what was already existing. And there's probably some things that we've talked about. I don't have any amendments right now, but the ones that we've been, trying to figure out what makes sense with the 200-foot buffer, the carve out for transferability of permits for a deceased spouse or domestic partner to their surviving spouse or domestic partner. So I think that's something we need just probably language to make adjustments as we move through the committee process. But overall, there's just a lot. And yeah, I'm just thankful for staff to walk us through this. It was a lot of work and it continues to be. So thank you.
Yeah, and I do think, the provision about one per natural person is definitely targeted at speculators, limiting, people who just have unlimited income and just want to buy up a neighborhood and turn it into STRs. That's not what we want to see. And so just add that. So did you have other questions? Director Isaacson, you had something further.
Yeah, just thank you, Councilor. Just to add a quick data point to your point, Councilor Villarreal. We do need more housing in the city, affordable housing and market rate housing. We currently have between 2,100 and 2,200 housing units under construction in the city of Santa Fe. So we are making progress in that area. We are starting to fill that gap, that deficit of housing. And hopefully that will, as we start to fill in housing at all price points, hopefully that will also contribute to the overall affordability of housing in our city.
Yeah, thank you all for that answer. I know it's a very complex issue, and just like we have frequently said that there is no single solution for affordable housing. I know that short-term rentals are not the only challenge that we have to, as I put it, affordable housing and housing that is affordable, and they are, two separate things that we have to consider. I have to say, my husband and I are in the housing market right now, or trying to buy a house right now. Obviously, we have weird constrictions to a district that other people don't have to worry about. It's rough. And so I have a lot of empathy for individuals that are trying to purchase a house right now, and you see them gone within a day. And I know that one that we were interested in looking at has now turned into a short-term rental, and that can be a little frustrating. But so I do appreciate all of the thought of all of the different factors, because as Councilor Villarreal pointed out, there are absolutely individuals that live in our community, that are part of our community, that their short-term rental is how they afford to be in our community. And as Councilor Garcia pointed out, tourism is such a huge piece of our economy, and really finding the balance between all of these pieces, I can imagine was and is a challenge. So thank you to the sponsors, and thank you to staff for all of your work into this and delving into such a complex but very necessary piece of legislation that we need to be looking at. I don't believe I have any other questions right now. I looked at my chicken scratch list, and I'm pretty sure I covered all of them, but if I interpret some of my lines, I'll let you know. So thank you.
Great. Any other questions? I will just let the committee know, Jennifer and I met with the housing, with the staff in the city who touch housing at any level. We are planning a series of presentations over the next, 4 months, let's say, to give this committee a deeper dive into where we are with housing, the kinds of things the city is doing, and We also want to hear from the advocates about some ideas of directions that we need to start to move in. And so just so you know that we will be providing more presentations on housing, because this is absolutely a critical area. So with that, if there aren't any other questions, Councilor Villarreal, if did you want to talk a little bit about this bill or?
No, I think I just did. I'm sorry. I like piggyback on what you said, what I said to wait on, and then I just went ahead for it. So I'm good. I don't have either comments.
Okay, and I guess the only thing I would add is that, you know, with this bill, we really are balancing interests, right? And that's a lot of what we do as counselors. I'm very excited that this bill is starting to move through the committees. We have worked on it a long time. It's been something that I've been interested in since I was elected. As was pointed out earlier, districts 1 and 2 have felt the impact of short-term rentals and our inability to regulate them and enforce properly. And we need to correct the negative impact that they've had. And I think the sponsors recognize that there is a role for short-term rentals in our lodging options in the city, especially being a tourist economy. But we need to correct the negative impact that they've had in some of the neighborhoods. And when I think about it, when I was going door to door, I heard a lot from people how their neighborhoods had changed, how they'd lost that quality of life of a neighborhood because there were so many people coming and going, and they don't live there, and they are, you know, it's not the same as having a neighbor, a long-term neighbor. And so I certainly heard a lot about the need to do this. And certainly in the South Capitol area, we know that, you know, there are big swaths of that area that are short-term rentals, and that's been hard on the people who live there long-term, year-round. So with that, I think we could entertain a motion to move this. I'm not sure what committee it goes to next. As I said at the beginning, the sponsors are talking about how to address some of the things that the Planning Commission asked that we think through. And, you know, I think there will be amendments down the road here, but none tonight. And so if we could get a motion to move this bill forward.
I move to approve.
Oh, or second.
Thanks.
All right. And Jennifer, do you want to call the roll?
Councilor Jamie Cassett Sanchez,
Yes.
Councilor Michael Garcia,
Yes.
Councilor Chris Rivera,
Yes.
Councilwoman Renee Villarreal,
Yes.
and Chair Carol Romero Worth.
Yes. Okay. So thank you, everybody. I think this is off to a good start. To thank you, staff, and getting to have the opportunity to talk about this and get some understanding. Let's see. I'm looking for my agenda. All right. Matters from staff. Jennifer, do you have anything?
None tonight, Chair.
Okay. Matters from the committee. Okay, matters from the chair. Our next meeting is November 4th. And we do have a couple presentations that I think you'll find very interesting. And we'll see you soon. I think we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Have a good night, everybody.